keep the focus on Africa with a new report from the McKinsey Global Institute. This report looks at how to reimagine the economy of Africa and also talks about using diversity to find more opportunities. There's the cover of the report, Reimagining Economic Growth in Africa, and of course using diversity to find opportunities. One of the authors of the report is with us now, Mayowa Kuyoro, who is the lead Fintech and Financial Services West Africa at McKinsey. Mayowa, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So yeah, look, I haven't even finished the report. It's so in-depth, great stuff. I think we should start with the population, with it expecting to double by 2050. What challenges and opportunities does that present?
So doubling by 2050 actually even hides another interesting fact, which is that we're going to add 800 million young people into the workforce by 2050. And when you compare that to other regions, compare that to China, compare that to America, compare that to Europe, where we see population flattening, I think the big opportunity that presents for us is the fact that we're going to be providing talent to the world. So it's not only talent for Africa, but also talent for the world. And so the flip side to that is, how do we ensure that the talent and the massive population that we are adding to the world is adequately skilled for the needs that the workforce has in the future? So I think a big question for our decision makers and stakeholders is how to ensure that our workforce and the people that we're adding into our population numbers are adequately skilled for the future.
Great stuff. The diversity part of the report, where it talks about using diversity, what are you referring to there? Inclusive growth? What do you mean by diversity?
You know, we all talk about Africa is not a country, Africa is not this, Africa is not that. But at the end of the day, a lot of the times when people are looking at Africa, we look at it as one monolithic entity. You look at the fact that growth has slowed, and we even say it in the reports that growth has slowed. But when you break it down, you see that different countries have different types of growth profiles. They have different types of sources of growth. You know, one of the things that I found very interesting was the fact that more than half or almost half of the population of Africa was living in countries where growth was above average. So, you know, I know that we always talk about the continent as one monolith. It's actually, 54 different entities that are sort of going across the development paths and choosing different ways to go forward, and we need to recognize that. And also, even within our own selves, learn from each other. I think that's another thing that we tend not to do. We don't learn from each other, and we have bright sparks and bright spots on the continent that we can learn from.
Great stuff. You mentioned the slowdown in economic growth. It probably took out from the report that GDP per capita growth over the last, I think since 1990, Africa has been slower than your China, your India. What's behind that?
There are a number of reasons behind the slowdown in growth, but one lens that we took this time, and I should have mentioned we do these reports maybe every 5 years. One lens that we took was looking at productivity. A lot of the conversations that happens around economic prosperity sort of focuses only on GDP growth, whereas we need to also be looking at what is happening to productivity. And when you look at our productivity across all our sectors, from agriculture to industry to services to extraction, we're actually lower productivity than a lot of the rest of the world. And when you couple that to sort of what is happening, you see it kind of begins to explain sort of what is underneath the numbers of the poor GDP growth.
Now, speaking of productivity, report says that if the potential, if Africa's productivity was somewhere to where China is, we could add like $1.4 trillion. What needs to happen to get to that level of productivity?
There are a number of things, and again, you look at the economy across the sectors. You look at, agriculture. You look at industry. You look at services, and you look at extractors. We did a piece of work as part of the reports in looking at each one of the different sectors and trying to understand what were the levers that could help drive growth over the next 10 years, right? And they range anything from sort of technology and digitization in the services sector to even just increasing agricultural farm produce. So using better seeds, better farm outputs can help us get more yield in some of our farmland. So the drive for productivity really sort of differs across the various sectors, but there are things that we know. right? And I think that is when we looked at the recommendations, we really wanted it to be super practical and not the usual, improve the ease of doing business. We all know this. We've been having these conversations for a very long time. We said, look, sector by sector by sector, what are the practical steps you need to take to help increase productivity across the various sectors?
The report also mentioned the number of companies on the continent that can have at least $1 billion in revenue. Is an increase in productivity the only way to achieve that, to get more companies on the African continent up to $1 billion? Because compared to North America, Europe, Asia, they have more. Or is it about improving the business environment to increase those numbers?
Absolutely. And again, we're looking at Africa in an aggregate. Out of those 345, I think you have 147 or so in South Africa alone, right? Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt have between 25 and 30. And so when you, again, look at actually, let me start with the good news. The good news is whenever we present this number, ask people this number outside of Africa, how many billion-dollar companies do you think they have? The first thing people say is between 50 and 100. So the fact that you have 345 is a good thing, right? It's a great thing because the way you would look at the continent is very different if you think it's $100 billion companies versus $345 billion companies. So I think that's one first good message. The second thing is, for each one of those industries and what can help sort of spur more and more billion-dollar companies, I think there are a number of things. You are right. Improving the business environment is one of that. But that, I think, also is a big catch-all, again, depending on the industry you're looking at. If I take financial services, which I sort of focus in, I think there's a lot to be said around increasing access to financial services to more than 40% of the population today that does not have access to financial services, and doing that in a sort of cost-effective manner. If you look at, again, I've talked about agriculture. If you look at extraction as an industry, actually, very interesting thing that we found during the report is our the amount of extraction we've done as a continent has actually declined over time. So again, increasing our output there. So I think there's a number of efficiency and productivity measures that we can do across the various different sectors to increase the number of billion-dollar companies we have on the continent.
All right, we were in Accra, as you saw there, the Afri-Exim Bank annual meetings, 30th anniversary. A lot of talk there about trade. Your report also touches on trade. How do we improve intra-Africa trade?
Yeah, again, the numbers are, I like numbers, so I always use numbers, but the numbers are very interesting. When you look at how much Africa trades with itself versus with other regions of the world, it's actually the region in the world that trades the least with itself, which is counterintuitive. I think we only, with our inter-African trade, we only trade around 16% of imports and exports with ourselves. Compare us to Latin America, that's 25%. Compare us to Asia, I think that's about 30% of trade within the region. So we just need to learn to trade better. I was reading yesterday or 2 days ago that someone said it is cheaper to ship a container from Singapore to Nigeria than it is to take from Nigeria to Ghana, right? That doesn't make sense. So we need to begin to increase our linkages because there is the proximity advantage that we're not taking advantage of, we're not leveraging. And trade, if we go back to the time of Adam Smith and co., is a way to drive the wealth of nations. So we do need to become more and more interconnected. And we're hoping that with the AFCTA and measures such as that we see more and more connections, we reduce trade barriers and so on and so forth to help drive connection within the continent.
Well, I want to ask you about natural resources and whether we are over-dependent. If you look at the top 5 natural resources that were in your report, crude oil, natural gas, there were a number of others, about 5 of them. Okay, yeah, so crude oil, natural gas, gold, iron ore, platinum, right? There's 2 quotes in the report that essentially say it was price increases that drove these valuables. So yeah, export revenues grew 17% year on year in the 2000s. 75% of that growth due to increased prices. So are we over dependent here? From 2010 to 2019, revenues from exported commodities fell 6% on average, with 60% decline driven by shrinking volume. So well, what's the takeaway from there?
I think our economies are not diversified. Our large economies, and when I say large, I mean the Nigerias of this world, the Angolas of this world, are not diversified enough, right? If you look at any sort of, there's so many different sectors. You have the agricultural sector, you have the industry, you have extraction, and you have services. We are quite heavily dependent either from an output basis, GDP, or from a country revenue basis, right, Forex, on resources. And we need to diversify the sources of income into our countries in order to help sort of mediate the volatility, exactly. Yeah. The volatility that you see when commodity prices shrink or change. So I think that in terms of commodities, we're blessed. We think about all that's happening with energy transition. Africa has a huge wealth, but I think what we need to do is ensure that it's not only the extraction, it's everything around that. It's the beneficiation of those commodities. It's creating jobs down the line for people in the services industry, ensuring that our agricultural base is also very strong in order to diversify our economies.
Hey, Mayowa, great report. I still got to finish the whole thing. Really in-depth, very, very informative. Really appreciate your time coming to join us to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mayowa Kuyoro, who is, of course, the lead Fintech and Financial Services West Africa at McKinsey. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.